I used to think silence was peace. That was before the world went quiet. Now, silence is the sound of things that used to live. It started in early March. Boise still half frozen, the snow on the rooftops gray from exhaust and dust. I remember standing in my garage that morning, tightening the lids on my water barrels, listening to a local radio host joke about the flu sweeping through Seattle. I smiled. Not because I thought it was funny, but because I'd been waiting for something like this all my life. They called me paranoid. My coworkers, my ex-wife, even my brother back in Spokane. Jack, the world's not ending. You're just afraid to live in it. Maybe they were right. But fear has a funny way of turning into discipline when the lights go out. I had supplies for a year. 2 if I rationed. Canned food stacked in color-coded crates. Water filtration. Solar panels wired to a 12-volt system I'd built from a junkyard RV. Even a Faraday cage for my radio gear. I wasn't prepping for zombies back then, I was prepping for the collapse I saw coming in everything. The debt, the anger, the apathy. Still, nothing prepares you for the moment the TV shows stop, the sirens fade, and your phone dies mid-text. That happened on March 19th at 7:42 p.m. The last message I got was from my brother. They're locking down Spokane. Don't let anyone in. Then nothing. By the second day, the city felt like a movie set after filming wrapped. No engines. No dogs barking. Just the hum of wind through empty streets. I took my truck into town, scanning the roads like I was the last man alive. Maybe I was. I passed Albertson's Market. The windows were shattered, the parking lot littered with carts and canned beans. A woman's body was slumped near the entrance, half covered by a tarp. Her face looked chewed. The smell hit before I saw the movement. I thought she was dead, she wasn't. She twitched, jerked once, and her eyes rolled up white like frost over glass. The sound she made, like air being forced through a broken accordion, was the sound that started the end of the world for me. I backed away. Slowly. I had my sidearm, a .357 revolver. My hand shook as I raised it, but I didn't shoot. Not yet. Not until she started crawling toward me, dragging her nails through her own skin like it didn't belong to her anymore. When I pulled the trigger, I aimed for the head. I didn't miss. The silence afterward was worse than the shot. That night, I sealed the door of my bunker. 4 inches of steel. Triple locks. No windows. The hum of the air filter was the only thing reminding me I was still breathing. I wrote in my logbook like I always did. March 19th, grid down. First contact with infected. No survivors visible in immediate vicinity. Lockdown initiated. I kept my flashlight on the concrete walls, tracing the lines I'd drawn years ago. Escape routes, emergency plans, radio frequencies. Every inch of that space was my world now. I thought I'd feel safe. But when the power grid dies, the world doesn't go dark. It changes color. There's no hum of electricity, no distant planes or passing cars. The silence becomes a living thing. You start hearing your own pulse in your ears. You start thinking about how thin those steel walls really are. Around midnight, I heard it, not from the bunker but from above. Scratching. Slow. Deliberate. Then a soft thud like someone dropped to their knees right above me. For hours I listened. My breath caught between every creak of the earth. I thought about my brother. About my ex-wife who'd moved to Portland last year. About how, for all my planning, I'd never prepared for the sound of someone, or something, clawing at the door I'd built to keep the world out. When dawn came, I climbed the ladder, cracked the hatch an inch, and peered through the scope. There were footprints in the frost. Bare, human, but twisted at the heel, like whoever made them had forgotten how to walk. And then I saw it, a smear of blood on the hatch. Fresh. I closed the latch and didn't sleep for 3 days. Journal entry, March 22nd. I keep hearing movement. Not sure if it's people or them. Power cells at 84%. Ration plan adjusted to stretch to 14 months. No communication on ham frequencies 2 to 9. The world didn't end in fire or war. It ended in silence. I didn't hear the screams that night, but I heard the radio. It started at 2:13 a.m., just as I was drifting into the shallow kind of sleep that comes when you know the world outside might still be moving. A crackle cut through the static, a noise so faint it sounded like it came from inside my head. Then, This is Boise Emergency Broadcast Service. All residents are advised to shelter in place. Do not engage with infected individuals. Repeat. I sat up straight. The words were warped, the signal weak, but it was a human voice. After 3 days of nothing but wind, I would have believed an angel was talking. I turned the tuner, hunting for clarity. The message looped, fragmenting between bursts of static. Then another voice, different, desperate. They're not dead. They're changing. Don't. The signal cut, replaced by white noise. I wrote it down in my logbook anyway. Old habits die hard. Even at the end of the world, I was still logging data like someone might read it later. By morning, I needed air. I climbed the ladder and eased open the hatch just enough to see daylight. The neighborhood was still, too still. My old F-150 sat in the driveway, half frozen over. The street beyond was littered with newspapers, a toppled trash can, and a single child's shoe. The suburban silence looked like a photograph from a world that had just stopped. I decided to check on Bill. He lived 2 houses down. Retired trucker. Used to laugh at my stockpile of beans and freeze-dried meals. But the week before all this, he'd come by asking about generators and water filtration. Something in his eyes told me he was starting to believe I'd been right. The walk there felt like trespassing through my own life. Every sound, the crunch of snow, the metallic groan of a gutter in the wind, felt amplified, sharp enough to cut skin. When I reached his door, I knocked softly. No answer. Then I heard it, movement inside. I raised my revolver, breathing through my nose, steady. The sound grew louder, uneven footsteps on wood. Then Bill's voice. Jack, that you? He opened the door halfway. His face was gray hollow. The skin under his eyes hung loose, and his hands trembled like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Jesus, Bill, I said. You look like hell. He laughed once, a rasp that turned into a cough. Power went out. Helen's sick. Don't know what to do. You got any medicine? I hesitated. My first rule, help no one. But Helen had brought me pie every Thanksgiving since I moved in. Yeah, I lied. Let me get my kit. I ran back to the bunker, heart pounding. Every prepper plan I'd ever made, all the charts, the drills, the scenarios, none of it covered watching your neighbors fall apart while you're the only one ready for it. When I returned, Bill had left the door open. The house smelled like rot and bleach. Helen was on the couch under a blanket, her skin as white as wax. Her eyes were open, but they didn't track me. Bill, I whispered, how long's she been like this? He didn't answer. He just stared at her, shaking. Then, without warning, she sat up. The sound she made wasn't human. A gurgling hiss like a pipe bursting underwater. She reached for him, and Bill didn't even move. I did. The revolver was in my hand before I knew it. One shot. Helen's body dropped back, still. The smell of gunpowder mixed with something foul and sweet, like meat left in the sun. Bill turned to me slowly, tears streaking through the grime on his cheeks. What did you do, Jack? I had no words. Just the ringing of the shot bouncing through the walls. He went for the gun on the counter. I raised mine again, hands trembling. Don't, I warned. He froze, looking at me with something I'll never forget, grief, rage, and relief all tangled together. Then he dropped to his knees beside her, whispering her name. I backed away, left the house, and locked myself inside my bunker until the sun came up again. Journal entry, March 23rd. Broadcast still looping. Possible government collapse. Neighbor deceased. Casualties confirmed local. No contact from Spokane or Portland. I killed a woman today. She wasn't human anymore, I think. The way Bill looked at me before I left. I've seen that look in mirrors. On the 4th day, the radio changed again. The same female voice, but now strained, hurried. Refuge points established north of Boise. Interstate 84 not safe. Infection rate. Then another voice cut in over her. A man this time, breathless, terrified. They're not dead, they're learning. Static. Then silence again. That was the last time I heard an official broadcast from Boise. The city's voice was gone. And as I sat in that steel room, staring at the flickering glow of my battery light, I realized something terrible. All my years of preparing had been for this, but survival wasn't what I'd imagined. It wasn't gunfights and glory. It was sitting in the dark, listening to ghosts argue through static. When the air filter clicked off for its nightly cool down, the silence felt absolute. Then, faintly through the stillness, came a sound I hadn't heard in a week. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. 2 sets. Moving right over my bunker. I killed the light and pressed my ear to the ceiling. They paused. Then one of them spoke. A low male voice, hoarse. "Think he's down there?" My chest went cold. Another voice, softer, closer. "Check the hatch." The steel above me groaned. I aimed my revolver at the ladder and waited, every muscle rigid. For the first time since the outbreak began, I realized the dead weren't the only ones I needed to hide from. I've always had rules. Preppers live by rules. Some are practical, some are obsessive, and some are borderline insane. But they kept me alive. Rule number 1, stay invisible. Everything else, food, water, ammo, is useless if someone sees you coming. Or worse, if they see you when you don't want them to. The morning after the broadcast went silent, I scoped the neighborhood. Houses were looted, streets empty. At first it felt like freedom. Then I remembered Helen and Bill. And the way Bill looked at me before I left the house. Not fear exactly, but something heavier, something that sank into my chest and stayed. I double-checked the perimeter of my bunker. Solar panels intact. Roof vent closed. Water barrels locked. Everything as it should be. I left a single motion sensor on the driveway angled toward the street. And then I saw them. 2 figures moving fast down the road. Jackets caked with frost. Faces obscured by scarves and hoods. Not infected. Not yet. But desperate. I ducked behind the garage and watched. They were scavengers. Real ones, human ones, the kind that will kill first and ask questions later. My stomach tightened. I hadn't needed to fire a shot yet. I hoped it stayed that way. I spent the next 3 days in a routine. Check the perimeter, scan with binoculars, document every scrap of movement, ration water, ration food, ration energy. Every night, I listened to the wind through the broken streets, imagining what it might hide. The scavengers came back on the 4th day. This time, one of them stopped by the corner of my driveway. I froze. He crouched and picked up a small frozen bottle, water probably, and slung it into his backpack. Rule number 1 in action, invisible. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waited. When they left, I exhaled slowly, my hands shaking. My heart still hammered from the reminder, being ready wasn't enough. You had to be unseen. It wasn't just humans that made you careful. The infected were learning, adapting. I'd seen it in Helen's twitch in the mail carrier I shot the week before. They didn't stumble anymore. They slithered, crawled, and even ran. And sometimes if you made the wrong sound, they followed your scent like dogs tracking prey. So I stayed invisible. Even to the wind. On day 5, I decided to risk the street for supplies. My pantry was holding, but my medical kit was running low. I had to move. I wrapped my face with a scarf, stuffed my jacket with layers, and picked my path carefully. Alleys, shadows, abandoned cars. Every step calculated. Every sound absorbed. At the corner of 10th and River Street, I saw a gas station looted but not burned. I slipped inside through a side door, kicking up frost. Inside, empty shelves stared at me like accusing eyes. But in the back, I found a small first aid kit, some painkillers, bandages. Enough for now. Then I heard it. A low, grating growl from the front of the store. My pulse spiked. I crouched, barely breathing, watching the shadows twist. A woman appeared, her clothes tattered, face pale, hands shaking as she dug through a shelf. She didn't notice me. She didn't even see the body slumped against the counter behind her. I swallowed hard. Rule number 1, stay invisible. I left her to her scavenging, backing out as quietly as I could. That night, back in the bunker, I wrote it all down. March 25th, humans are as dangerous as the infected. Observation confirmed. 1 scavenger sighting, 1 near miss. Medical supplies secured. Continue to ration. Maintain invisibility. Check perimeter 0, 500, 1200, 1800 hours. Never engage unless necessary. But the truth? Every rule felt heavier. Being invisible meant I couldn't help anyone. It meant Bill had died, Helen had died, and I had survived only because I was careful, methodical, cold. By the end of the week, I realized the most important part of rule number 1 wasn't staying unseen. It was staying detached. Every human connection, every moment of empathy could get you killed. And that terrified me more than the dead ever could. The next morning, as I checked the horizon with my binoculars, I saw movement again. This time, farther off. A group, at least 6 people. Armed. Organized. Not looters. Predators. I ducked behind the garage. My revolver loaded, my heart steady. I had survived the first human test. But I knew the bigger one was coming. Rule number 1 wasn't just survival. It was a promise. Don't get seen. Don't get caught. Don't get weak. Because in a world full of monsters, both living and dead, the invisible ones are the only ones who make it. Winter was brutal that year, sharper than I'd ever felt in Boise. The snow didn't just fall, it smothered. Streets became white rivers, cars frozen in mid-motion like statues of a forgotten civilization. And in that frozen silence, the world changed. I started noticing the things I had once ignored. The broken mailbox with frost crusting its edges, the skeletal trees clawing at the sky, the silence of streets where kids had played. And then there were the bodies. The first one I saw was on the corner of River Street, not far from the looted gas station I had scavenged last week. A man, middle-aged, wearing a torn hoodie, slumped against a lamppost. His skin was gray, cracked like old paint, and his hands were frozen in a clawing gesture, fingers bent unnaturally. I froze. For a moment I felt the old human reflex. Reach out, help, check for a pulse. But the smell, the rigidity, the unnatural stillness, it told me everything. He wasn't dead in the way we understood death. Not entirely. He was one of them. I backed away, careful not to leave footprints, and raised my binoculars. From a distance I could see more, bodies frozen mid-motion, as if time itself had stopped while the infection worked. A child curled up on a porch step, eyes open and staring at nothing. A woman leaning over a shopping cart, groceries spilled in the snow like sacrificial offerings. Each one a story, a life, a family lost. And none of them alive. I walked past the city park, the ground crunching beneath my boots. The swings moved slightly in the wind, squeaking a sorrowful note. I remembered bringing my nephew here years ago, pushing him so high he squealed like a bird. Now all that noise was gone. Silence ruled everything. And yet the air wasn't empty. The infected moved underneath it in ways you couldn't always see. I learned quickly that visibility wasn't just about avoiding humans. Sometimes it was about sensing danger before it sensed you. I found one close enough to test that rule. A man, frozen in the snow, one hand outstretched like he'd been reaching for me. I tilted my head, studying him. His jaw twitched. A groan escaped. I didn't hesitate. I put a clean shot between his eyes. There was no satisfaction in it, no thrill. Just a cold efficiency. And a deep, gnawing emptiness. By the end of that first week, I had a routine. Scavenge during the day, document what I found, return before nightfall. Always invisible. Always alone. Yet the emotional weight grew heavier. Every corpse told a story I couldn't save. Every abandoned home screamed at me. I had prepared for months for survival, but I hadn't prepared for loss. Not this kind. At night, I wrote in my log. March 28th, observation. Bodies frozen mid-motion. Infection persists despite freezing temperatures. Behavior patterns suggest coordination. Moral deterioration of survivors expected. Isolation causing psychological strain. Maintain invisibility, limit exposure, conserve ammunition. Even as I wrote it clinically, I felt the irony. I was recording humanity's demise with the same detached tone I used for inventory. And maybe that was the only way I could keep going. A week later, on a supply run to the grocery store near 11th Avenue, I stumbled on a sight that stopped me cold. A dog. Not dead. Not frozen. Alive, trembling and alone, dragging a leash across the snow. No collar. No owner. Its ribs were visible beneath matted fur. Its eyes locked on me, pleading. I should have ignored it. Rule number 1. Stay invisible. Survival first. But I didn't. I approached slowly, crouching, talking in the softest voice I could manage. The dog hesitated, then wagged a cautious tail. Its fur bristled, its body shaking. Hunger, cold, fear, all mixed in a single fragile creature. I knelt, offering a small ration of dried meat I'd been saving. It took it eagerly, then pressed against my leg. I felt something stir inside me, a reminder that life existed beyond survival, that humanity wasn't entirely gone. And then I remembered Bill, Helen, the little girl on the porch at River Street. Survival was only half the battle. The other half was keeping your heart from freezing along with everything else. That night, back in the bunker, I cleaned my revolver, rationed the food, and wrote, March 30th, encountered living animal. Morale improves slightly. Reminder, empathy is dangerous but necessary. Maintain vigilance. Isolation weighs heavily. Mental fortitude critical. As I lay in my cot, listening to the wind scrape against the steel walls, I realized something fundamental. The dead were terrifying. But what haunted me most were the things they used to breathe, humans frozen in time, the echo of their lives, the relentless reminder that the world I knew was gone. And yet, in that horror, I felt the first spark of purpose since it began. If I could survive the frozen dead, maybe, just maybe, I could survive everything else too. I never thought I'd have to kill a friend. Not in war. Not in accidents. Not in the quiet hell of the frozen streets. But that morning, I faced a truth every prepper fears. Sometimes survival isn't just about hiding, it's about making impossible choices. Bill was alive when I found him. Barely. He'd barricaded himself in what was left of his garage, surrounded by empty propane tanks and frozen cans of food. His wife, Helen, had been gone 3 days, her absence leaving him hollow, frantic. When I climbed the ladder to my bunker's observation hatch, I saw him through the binoculars. His movements were erratic, panicked. Hands shaking, eyes darting to every shadow. He hadn't eaten properly since the outbreak began. He was a storm of fear and grief, and I knew he was close to breaking. I had my rules. I followed them strictly. Never intervene unless necessary. But he was my neighbor, my friend. And something in me whispered that I couldn't just watch him die. I descended and approached cautiously. Bill, I called softly, keeping my revolver close but hidden. It's Jack. You okay? He turned and I froze. His eyes, they weren't fully human anymore. Or maybe they were human but stripped of reason. They darted between me and the shadows. Jack, he cried. They took her. Helen. I didn't wait for him to finish. I motioned for him to calm down, to sit, to breathe. But he didn't listen. His hands found the revolver I'd left on the counter, the one I used to secure supplies earlier. He was shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind: stay invisible. Survival first. Don't get caught. But that was impossible now. Bill fired. I dove behind the doorframe. The shot missed me, but splintered wood and frost flew in every direction. Bill? I shouted. Stop. It's me. Another shot. Closer. Closer. I could see the panic in his face, the horror that had replaced reason. I raised my revolver. Calmly. Carefully. Every prepper instinct I'd honed over decades screamed at me, aim for the head. 1 shot. Cling. Quick. I fired. He collapsed instantly. No scream, just a heavy thud, a life extinguished in a fraction of a second. I stood over him, revolver still smoking. The frost from the broken garage door swirled around us like smoke from a fire that no longer burned. I shouldn't have felt anything. I should have been stoic like I always was. But as I knelt to check his pulse, a useless gesture, I knew, my chest tightened. I could see the memory of the man he had been before the world ended, laughing at my prepper habits, teaching his son to ride a bike, offering me pie every Thanksgiving. Gone. Rule number 1 saved me, but it came at a cost I hadn't anticipated. The weight of killing someone I loved, even if it was mercy, even if it was survival. I cleaned my revolver and secured the garage. Bill's body would have to stay there. I didn't have the time, the strength, or the tools to move him. I didn't have the heart. By the time night fell, I was back in my bunker. The cold seeped through the walls, but it didn't touch the ache in my chest. I wrote in my journal. April 2nd, Bill deceased. Engagement necessary for survival. Mortality of humans confirmed. Emotional strain high. Maintain invisibility. Observation of neighborhood ongoing. Supplies adequate for 10 months. Continue rationing. Mental fortitude critical. Writing didn't help. Counting bullets, sealing doors, stacking cans. None of it helped. I realized something I hadn't before. Stoicism could only carry you so far. Eventually, the ghosts of the people you couldn't save would haunt you. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind against my steel walls. Somewhere beyond the frost and snow, the world moved on. But for me, time had stopped. And I knew deep down that the first year of survival would be defined not by the dead, but by the living, by the choices I'd be forced to make, and the people I would inevitably lose along the way. The first winter after the outbreak wasn't just cold, it was endless. Snow buried roads, covered cars, and trapped the city under a white, silent tomb. I survived. I had supplies, sure, but no amount of canned food or filtered water can prepare a man for the slow, gnawing sensation that comes when every meal is measured in days, not hunger. Hunger doesn't just attack your stomach. It claws at your mind, steals your patience, and forces your morality into corners you didn't know existed. By mid-January, my rations were no longer comfortable. They were lifelines. I measured every bite, every sip of water. The beans I once considered mediocre were now sacred. Each dried morsel became a ritual. I found myself kneeling before a small stash, whispering thanks to no one. Hunger, in a way, had become religion. But supplies can only stretch so far. One day, while checking my binoculars along the street outside my bunker, I noticed smoke rising in the distance. A small plume, steady and unnatural. Human activity. I knew the rules. Observe first, intervene later. But desperation has a way of making men careless. I approached slowly, staying hidden behind snow-dusted cars and frozen hedges. At the source, I found a small encampment of survivors. 3 men, 2 women, scavenging what they could from an abandoned grocery store. They had a fire going and were cooking what I couldn't identify. Their eyes met mine as I emerged from cover. Panic, suspicion, hunger. It was all there. One of the men reached for a rifle slung over his shoulder. I raised my hands, revolver still hidden. "I don't want trouble," I said. They laughed. Not humor, but disbelief. "Trouble? Look at us. Look at you. This world is trouble." One of the women, her face thin, cheekbones sharp from starvation, stepped closer. "You've got food," she said. I realized she wasn't asking, she was declaring. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind. Stay invisible. Avoid humans. Survival first. But hunger is a merciless teacher. And sometimes, it demands attention before rules. I retreated silently. That night, back in the bunker, I rationed even tighter. Every morsel was measured. Every sip of water calculated. I slept with a revolver under my pillow, dreaming of the faces I had seen, gaunt, desperate, almost inhuman. And yet, in those dreams, I also saw another truth. The living could be just as dangerous as the dead. Desperation doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about morality, friendship, or the man who spent a lifetime preparing. Hunger strips everything down to the raw core. By the 3rd week, I ventured further. I scavenged along I-184, taking the old service roads. Cars abandoned mid-turn, shopping carts frozen in place. The bodies were everywhere, frozen, twisted, reminders of what I'd left behind. And then I saw it, a small group huddled in a burned-out convenience store, feasting on a dead animal. The smell hit me before the sight did. Hunger had taught them lessons I wasn't ready to hear. I backed away, leaving them to their grim ritual. I told myself it was wisdom. Survival first. Observation second. Compassion later, maybe. But the truth is, I watched them anyway. I watched the way hunger made them desperate, brutal, willing to cross lines I couldn't imagine. Hunger teaches religion, yes, but it also teaches cruelty, how quickly civilization can crumble when food runs out. I returned to my bunker that night, exhausted, cold, and yet strangely awake. I documented everything, the scavengers, their fire, the animal. Every detail mattered. One day someone might read these logs. And if they did, I wanted them to know that hunger wasn't just a physical trial. It was a test of morality, patience, and sanity. By the end of that first month of snow and silence, I realized that survival wasn't about living through the dead. It was about living through the hunger, the gnawing, relentless hunger, and keeping yourself human when the world demanded that you forget what that word meant. Journal entry, February 12th. Supplies diminishing. Observation. Human survivors adapting. Starvation observed to cause aggression, moral compromise, and irrational decision-making. Isolation protective. Maintain stealth. Ammunition sufficient for 3 to 4 months at current rationing. Continue monitoring scavenger groups. Psychological health declining. Keep logs for mental stability. That was when I first understood. In this new world, hunger wasn't just a physical need. It was a teacher. A cruel, unforgiving teacher. And I had no choice but to learn its lessons, or die. The radio had been silent for weeks. I spent hours every day tuning the frequencies, adjusting dials, rewiring antennas, hoping for a voice, any voice, that wasn't just static or my own heartbeat amplified through the steel walls of the bunker. And then one evening it happened. A faint crackle. At first I thought it was the wind. But then a voice. Low, ragged, almost swallowed by static. If anyone's out there, we're still alive. Montana, heading north, repeat. Montana? I froze. I hadn't heard a human voice since Bill. Not really. Not in a way that meant connection, that meant possibility. This wasn't a broadcast from a government station. This was a survivor. Someone like me, somewhere out there, reaching through the static in a desperate attempt to be heard. I scribbled in my journal immediately. February 20th, ham frequency intercepted. Human voice detected. Location, Missoula, Montana. Possible survivors. Signal weak but persistent. Evaluate feasibility of travel north. Maintain caution. I spent the next 3 days monitoring the signal. It wasn't constant. Sometimes it came through clearly, sometimes all I got was broken syllables and static bursts. But I learned the pattern. Every 12 hours, a faint signal from the north, speaking of food, safety, and the promise of others who had survived. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe so badly that my chest ached. And yet, risk is everything. Boise wasn't safe. The streets were crawling with scavengers, desperate humans, and the occasional infected wandering through the snow. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the life I'd maintained in that bunker for months could end in a second. I double-checked my gear. Revolver with 6 rounds per cylinder, fully loaded. Survival knife. Water purification tablets. 2 weeks of rationed food. Map of Idaho and western Montana with potential routes marked. I ran every scenario in my head. Blocked roads, scavenger ambushes, encounters with infected, blizzards, and, worst of all, betrayal by another human. And still the signal called to me. On the 4th day I made a decision. I couldn't stay underground forever. I couldn't survive on beans and filtered water alone, watching the world decay through a thin layer of frost and steel. If there were others alive, if there was a chance of real human contact, I had to take it. I packed my backpack with precision, every item carefully considered. Then I climbed back to the hatch, looked at the frozen streets, and whispered to myself, stay invisible. Stay alive. Move north. The journey began at first light. I moved cautiously, using alleys, shadows, and abandoned cars for cover. Every sound made me jump. The whistle of wind through a broken fence, the faint scraping of metal in the distance. I remembered rule number 1. Stay invisible. But now, rule number 1 had a purpose beyond mere survival. It was about reaching others, about finding a reason to keep living. Hours passed. I stopped only when I reached the outskirts of Boise. The highway loomed ahead, I-84, a ribbon of ice and asphalt stretching toward Montana. From the bunker it had seemed manageable. From here it was a gauntlet. Trucks abandoned mid-lane, frozen corpses sprawled across the asphalt, scavenger camps nestled in overpasses. I slipped through the gaps, moving silently, using my binoculars to scout every intersection. When I heard voices, not human, not undead, I ducked behind a snowbank, waiting for the moment to move. By nightfall, I found shelter in an abandoned rest area just off the highway. The radio crackled again. The faint voice came through, fragmented, almost pleading. Montana safe, north, survival, repeat. I whispered back, though I knew the person couldn't hear me. Jack Hart. Boise. I'm coming. It felt foolish. A one-way message in the dead world. But hope, I realized, is a dangerous thing, and also the only thing keeping a man like me alive. That night, I sat against the cold steel walls of the rest area, revolver across my lap, listening to the wind whistle through the broken roof. I imagined them, the other survivors, huddled in Montana, waiting, hoping, alive. And for the first time in months, the gnawing loneliness eased just slightly. The signal had given me purpose. And with purpose comes movement. Journal entry, February 25th. Ham frequency persistent. Montana survivors confirmed. Travel north initiated. Observation. Roads hazardous, humans unpredictable, infected present. Supplies sufficient for initial journey. Psychological state improved with prospect of contact. Objective. Reach Montana alive. The night passed slowly. I slept lightly, ears tuned to every whisper of wind, every distant groan, every crunch of snow. The first leg of the journey awaited at first light, a trek through frozen wasteland, human danger, and the unknown. And yet, despite the cold, the hunger, and the danger, I felt something I hadn't in months. Hope. Not naive hope. Practical hope. Stoic hope. The kind that keeps you moving when the world has gone silent. The highway stretched before me like a frozen artery, dead and lifeless, carrying the remnants of a world that had stopped. At 84, which had once thrummed with trucks and travelers, was now a graveyard. Semi-trucks abandoned mid-turn, their wheels locked in ice. Cars frozen as if caught in eternal panic. And scattered across it all, the remnants of humanity, or what humanity had become. I tightened the straps on my backpack and moved cautiously along the shoulder, revolver in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. Rule number 1 repeated itself like a mantra. Stay invisible. Not just for survival but for sanity. The first sign of trouble came after 2 miles. A semi-truck had jackknifed it across both lanes, blocking passage. Its cab door hung open. Inside, a man's body was slumped over the wheel, frozen in mid-motion, fingers gripping the steering wheel as if he'd been trying to hold on to life. I forced myself to look away. The dead had become a routine I couldn't escape. I detoured along the median, where the snow was less compacted, trying to avoid the ice that could give me away with a slip or a crunch. And that's when I saw them. 2 figures crouched behind the wreckage of a minivan. Human. Armed. Watching. Waiting. My pulse spiked. I ducked behind a guardrail, heart hammering. I could hear them whispering, though the wind carried their words away before I could make sense of them. Hunger, desperation, fear, I recognized it instantly. I'd seen it in Boise. It was the same in every survivor, primal, raw, dangerous. They moved closer to the semi. I held my breath, barely daring to blink. The first one stood, rifle raised, scanning the highway. His companion froze as his gaze swept past me, then both disappeared behind the wreckage again. I waited. Then I moved. Slowly. Deliberately. 1 step, then another, avoiding loose debris. Every sense screamed at me, the wrong sound could be fatal. Hours passed. I made it past the wreckage and into a narrower stretch of road where vehicles had slid off the pavement into snowbanks. There the smell hit me first. Rot, smoke, iron. Bodies. Not just dead, frozen corpses, but something worse. Scavengers. Humans scavenging the bodies of other humans. They hadn't noticed me yet. I stayed low, moving along the edge of the asphalt. I saw one reach for a backpack on a frozen corpse, fingers trembling with hunger and greed. Another dug through the pockets of a man in a blood-stained jacket. I swallowed. This was a side of humanity I'd prepared for intellectually, but not emotionally. Not this close. Not the stench, the raw desperation, the brutality of survival stripped down to its base instincts. By midday, exhaustion gnawed at me. My feet were cold, my water low, and the rations in my pack weren't enough for more than another day or 2 if I pushed forward. Yet I pressed on. The signal from Montana had become my compass, my reason, my tether to a world that might still exist. And then the highway gave me its final test. A blockade of vehicles abandoned in a chaotic heap. Semi-truck on its side, a delivery van crushed against a guardrail, and in the middle, 3 scavengers. One spotted me immediately, raising a pistol. I dove behind the nearest wreck, heart pounding. My revolver came up. Rule number 1 screamed at me, do not engage unless necessary. But the law of the highway was simple, if they saw you they would shoot. And if they didn't they might follow. Either way, my survival depended on remaining invisible. I waited. The wind howled, carrying the sound of ice crunching under boots. The scavenger raised the pistol, turned in a slow circle and then lowered it. He and his companions continued scavenging, oblivious to me pressed against the side of the highway. I exhaled quietly, moving past them, hugging the shadows, knowing that one wrong move would mean the end. By nightfall, I found shelter in an abandoned rest area. Rusted vending machines, graffiti-covered walls, and a roof that barely held snow made it less than ideal. But it was safe. For now. I checked my revolver, laid out my rations, and listened to the wind tearing across the empty highway. I thought about the people I'd seen, the scavengers, the frozen corpses, the small encampments along the way. Each one a reminder that survival wasn't about fighting zombies. It was about outlasting the living. And as I lay against the cold steel walls, writing in my journal. Journal entry, March 1st, highway traversal completed, 18 miles north. Scavenger presence confirmed. Avoid engagement. Frozen bodies numerous, psychological impact noted. Supplies adequate for next 2 days if rationed. Montana signal persistent, objective, reach northern coordinates. Mental state stable, vigilance critical. I realized something terrifying. The first year of the outbreak wasn't just about surviving the dead. It was about surviving the road itself. A frozen, merciless gauntlet where every human could be your enemy, and every shadow could hide death. And yet, I kept moving. One step, one careful calculation at a time. Because hope, as faint as it was, demanded it. The Snake River stretched below the bridge like a ribbon of ice and shadow. Water moved beneath the frozen crust, dark and relentless, reminding me that life still existed somewhere beyond the stillness of death. The bridge itself had seen better days. Rust streaked the steel beams, concrete cracked under the relentless winter. I paused at the entrance, scanning for movement. Rule number 1, stay invisible. Every survival instinct screamed at me to slow, to observe, to calculate. It was quiet at first. Too quiet. I took my first step onto the bridge, boots crunching on ice and gravel. Halfway across, I noticed them, footprints. Not old, fresh, pressed into the snow. Someone had crossed before me, carrying weight, moving cautiously. And then I heard it, a voice, low, muffled, carried by the wind. Did you hear that? I froze. 2 figures emerged from behind the guardrail, rifles slung, eyes scanning. They weren't infected, not yet. But desperation made them dangerous. Hunger made them unpredictable. And fear made them lethal. I ducked behind a support beam, waiting. They spoke quietly, planning, cursing. I realized then that I was no longer just traversing a highway. I was moving through someone else's war zone. The first one spotted movement behind a pile of frozen debris. I saw him, he shouted. The second turned, rifle raised. I pressed myself flat, breath held, feeling the steel under my fingers, the frozen bridge trembling under the weight of ice in my nerves. One misstep. One twitch. Dead. I waited. Calculated. I had my revolver ready, but my plan wasn't confrontation. It was evasion. Every step I had taken since leaving Boise had been practice for this exact moment. The 2 scavengers paused, glanced around, and I moved, slow, deliberate, sticking to shadows, keeping low. Each footfall measured. The wind howled, masking my movement. They didn't see me. Then the bridge groaned. A loose plank shifted beneath my weight. The scavengers froze, rifles trained in my direction. I swore quietly, adjusting stance. One shot rang out, shattering ice. It ricocheted off the steel with a shriek. My heart jumped into my throat. I ducked lower, and for the first time I realized how fragile life really was. One misstep, one sound, and it was over. The wind carried my scent, my breath, the faint rustle of clothing. They moved cautiously now, stepping over the snow-covered planks, rifles sweeping. I counted their steps in my head, waiting for the right moment. And then I slipped. Not a fall, but a slide, boots catching on ice, hands scraping steel. Noise echoed across the bridge. Both scavengers turned. I froze. One raised his rifle. The other muttered something I couldn't hear. My mind raced. I could fight. I could run. But the bridge was narrow, the planks unstable, the river below a frozen death trap. I ran. A split-second decision. I vaulted over a railing support, pressed my body against the steel beams, and moved like a shadow along the edge. Bullets whizzed past, ricocheting off metal. The scavengers cursed, shouted, ran after me. But they didn't follow onto the edge, too risky. I slid down a small embankment, rolled into the snow, and kept moving. The bridge loomed above me, a frozen monument to human desperation. When I finally stopped, chest heaving, revolver still in hand, I realized the truth. Surviving humans required more than weapons or rules. It required calculation, timing, and cold detachment. By nightfall, I had reached the northern bank. The bridge loomed behind me, a gaunt reminder of the dangers I had narrowly avoided. I found shelter in a collapsed cabin, firewood scattered, roof partially caved. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. For now. I wrote in my journal. March 10th, Snake River Bridge traversed. Scavenger encounter. Evasion successful. Observation. Humans as dangerous as infected. Mental state stable but alert. Supplies adequate for 24 hours. Montana signal still active. Continue north. Maintain invisibility and caution. As I lay awake, listening to the river beneath the ice, I realized something chilling. The dead were terrifying, yes, but the living were the real threat. And out here, on the frozen roads and bridges of Idaho, the line between life and death was measured in inches, in frozen footprints, in one careless sound. The bridge was behind me, but the lesson stayed. In a world where everyone is desperate, invisibility isn't just survival. It's salvation. The highway ended abruptly near a cluster of buildings half buried in snow, a town abandoned in the early days of the outbreak. Streets were silent except for the occasional groan of ice cracking beneath the weight of forgotten vehicles. Storefronts stared back at me like the hollow eyes of corpses, windows shattered, signs swinging in the wind. I approached cautiously, revolver ready, boots crunching softly against snow and debris. Rule number 1 echoed in my mind. Stay invisible. Every creaking board, every frozen gutter, every shadow could conceal life or death. The first building I entered was a general store. Inside, shelves were tipped over, cans spilled across the floor. But unlike the looted stores of Boise, something was different here. It was organized chaos. Someone had been surviving, and judging by the remnants, small fire pits, scavenged blankets, footprints leading to hidden corners, they were methodical. I noted the details in my journal. March 15th, northern settlement discovered. Evidence of human habitation. Occupants unknown. Supplies partially scavenged. Signs of organized survival. Proceed with caution. Observation recommended. I moved carefully through the aisles, listening for movement. Nothing. Just the wind, the occasional drip of melting snow through the roof, and my own heartbeat. Outside, I discovered more signs of life. Footprints leading to a narrow alley, a series of small traps meant to alert the inhabitants to intruders. I realized this wasn't a random scavenger camp. This was a community of survivors, intelligent, coordinated, and dangerous. I crouched behind a collapsed wall, scanning the street. 2 figures appeared, carrying makeshift weapons, crowbars, knives, and a rifle slung over one shoulder. They paused, examining a frozen car, then continued down the street. No words, no laughter, no sign of fear. Just survival. I stayed hidden. I had no desire to make contact. For all I knew, they would shoot on sight. Montana was my goal. Interaction here was unnecessary risk. That night, I found shelter in the remains of a school building. Desks were overturned, papers scattered, windows broken. I blocked the door with a heavy table, set my motion sensors, and ate my meager rations. I wrote in my journal. March 16th, small survivor group observed. Strategy: avoid contact. Supplies sufficient for 48 hours if rationed. Psychological note: humans as dangerous as infected. Maintain invisibility. Continue north to Montana. Even as I wrote, I felt the weight of loneliness pressing down. Seeing signs of organized human life reminded me of what I had lost in Boise: Bill, Helen, neighbors, friends. Loneliness is a silent killer, creeping into the mind, whispering doubt and fear. The next day, as I scouted the perimeter, I found evidence of conflict. Bloodstains in the snow, a broken rifle, and tracks that led away from the town. Someone had been attacked. Maybe scavengers, maybe infected, maybe both. The sight tightened my chest. In a world where survival meant invisibility, even the organized could be wiped out in seconds. I stayed in the school for 2 days, observing, rationing, and planning. Montana was still hundreds of miles away, the signal faint but persistent. I knew the journey would get worse. The highway was no longer empty, and every survivor I encountered could mean death. By the 3rd day, I was ready to move again. I packed my gear, checked my revolver, and glanced back at the town. The footprints I left in the snow were deliberate, careful, erasing evidence of my presence. I whispered a quiet acknowledgement to the invisible people I had glimpsed, then stepped onto the northern road. The frozen town was behind me, a stark reminder that human ingenuity could exist even in apocalypse, and that surviving humans were often more dangerous than the dead. Journal entry, March 18th. Northern town scouted. Survivor group detected. No contact made. Supplies sufficient for initial journey. Montana signal still active. Maintain caution. Psychological note: observation of human behavior critical. Survival depends on invisibility and calculation. Moral compass tested. Emotional response contained. Proceed north. As I trudged through the snow, the Montana signal crackled faintly in my radio. Hope remained alive, but every step was measured, every breath cautious. The frozen town was a warning. The living are just as deadly as the dead, and survival isn't given. It's earned, one careful decision at a time. The canyon appeared suddenly, a jagged scar cutting through the snow-covered landscape. Its sheer walls and narrow path made it unavoidable, the only route north toward Montana. I stopped at the edge, scanning every angle, every shadow. The wind whistled through the cliffs, carrying the faint scent of frost and decay. Rule number 1: stay invisible. Every survival instinct screamed at me to slow, observe, and calculate. But I knew this stretch would be dangerous, confined, exposed, predictable. I stepped into the canyon slowly. Each footfall carefully placed to avoid loose stones and icy patches. The echoes of my boots bounced off the cliffs, and I cursed under my breath. One misstep, one sound could mean death. Halfway through, I saw them. 3 figures crouched behind rocks, their rifles trained on the path. Their eyes were sharp, scanning, alert. They were survivors, not infected, but the desperation in their posture told me they'd shoot without hesitation. I ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding. My revolver was ready, but I didn't want a firefight. I had no ammo to waste, and Montana was still miles away. The first man moved forward cautiously, scanning left and right. A woman with a crowbar followed, tense, her eyes narrowing at every sound. The last, a young man, muttered to himself, hands shaking. Hunger and fear had carved desperation into their faces. I calculated the distance, the angle of the sun, the wind carrying their scent. There was a path along the cliff's edge, narrow, treacherous, but unseen. I could bypass them. Survival depended on it. I moved, one careful step at a time. Snow crunched faintly beneath my boots. I froze. The man turned. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. He raised his rifle. Rule number 1 screamed in my mind. Do not engage unless necessary. Stay invisible. Survive. I dove to the side, rolling down a small embankment, bullets whizzing past where my head had been seconds before. My revolver snapped up, but I didn't fire. Engagement wasn't the goal, survival was. I scrambled along the cliff edge, keeping low, using rocks and shadows for cover. The canyon walls echoed with shouts, curses, and gunfire ricochets as the three tried to track me. I slipped through a narrow fissure, snow and stone scraping my clothes, and finally silence. The canyon opened into a wider valley. I exhaled, chest heaving, revolver still raised. The encounter left me shaken. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and the adrenaline refused to leave. Survival wasn't just about outlasting the dead. It was about outlasting humans, clever, desperate, and unbound by morality. I documented the encounter immediately. March 21st, Canyon ambush. Human threat confirmed. Engagement unnecessary, evasion successful. Psychological note: adrenaline spike, emotional response contained. Observation: survivors organized, aggressive, likely scavengers. Supplies sufficient. Montana signal persistent. Even as I wrote, the canyon loomed behind me, a reminder that human threats could appear anywhere at any time. One miscalculation could end everything. By nightfall, I found shelter in a hollowed-out outcropping along the canyon wall. I blocked the entrance with rocks, checked my revolver, and rationed water carefully. Hunger gnawed, but I couldn't afford distraction. Survival demanded focus, patience, and cold calculation. I listened to the wind, imagining the three hunters below, their voices fading into the distance. The canyon had been a test, one I had barely passed. But each test hardened me, honed my instincts, and reinforced the only rule that mattered: stay invisible. Journal entry, March 22nd. Ambush at canyon completed. Human threats confirmed as highly dangerous. Evasion preferred over engagement. Ammunition preserved. Montana signal still active. Psychological state alert, controlled. Survival contingent on calculation and patience. Continue north. As I lay against the cold rock, watching the stars through the fissures in the canyon walls, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. The first year of survival wasn't about fighting zombies. It was about navigating the humans, cunning, desperate, and lethal, who remained. The canyon had taught me that lesson in fire, snow, and the near taste of death. And I knew the road ahead would be worse. The train yard sprawled before me like a frozen skeleton. Boxcars lay derailed in the snow, some tilted on their sides, others stacked precariously. Rusted rails stretched endlessly into the distance, disappearing into fog and frost. I paused at the edge, scanning every shadow, every crack in the steel, every hollowed-out car. Rule number 1: stay invisible. Every step here could be my last. The yard was a perfect trap, cover for scavengers, snipers, or worse. I entered cautiously. The snow muffled my footsteps, but the metallic groan of shifting cars echoed in the cold air. Empty crates, broken pallets, and scattered tools littered the ground. At first it seemed deserted. Too quiet. Then I saw it, signs of recent human activity. Footprints leading into a cluster of boxcars. Fire pits, blackened but warm. Makeshift shelters inside the cars, blankets and food scraps carefully arranged. Humans were here. Someone had been using the yard as a temporary fortress. I crouched behind a rail car, revolver ready. Observation first. Engagement only if necessary. I explored cautiously. One boxcar revealed canned goods, enough to last me 2 weeks if rationed. Another held bottled water and a first aid kit. My heart raced. Supplies like these could mean the difference between life and death. But then I noticed the signs of a trap. Nails embedded in wood, tripwires strung across narrow corridors, and a series of pressure plates rigged to sound alarms. Whoever had been here wasn't just surviving, they were hunting. Travelers, scavengers, anyone desperate enough to approach. Rule number 1 screamed in my mind: do not engage unless necessary. Stay invisible. Survive. I took a deep breath and moved like a shadow. Step by step, I disarmed simple traps with tools I had scavenged along the way. My hands shook at first, adrenaline sharpening every sense. I mapped the boxcars mentally, noting escape routes and safe zones. Every second mattered. Then I heard voices, low, muttering, urgent. 2 men and a woman, their words indistinct through the metal walls. They were alive and they were guarding. I could wait for nightfall or I could risk a quick grab and go. I chose speed. Moving silently, I slipped into the largest boxcar with supplies. I grabbed what I could carry, packing water and canned food into my backpack. The fire pit inside still smoldered faintly, evidence of human presence moments ago. Footsteps. I froze. Two figures entered the car behind me, their rifles raised. Panic clawed at my chest. They scanned, muttering, then lowered their weapons slightly, perhaps thinking I had already left. I didn't risk it. I ducked behind crates, holding my breath, and waited. One step. Another. Shadows of their movement passed over me. Then, silently, I slipped out a side door, moving into the snow and ice beyond the yard. By the time I was a safe distance away, chest heaving, backpack full, I realized how lucky I had been. Humans weren't predictable. They weren't bound by morality. They were predators, using ingenuity and desperation as weapons. And I had survived by being invisible. I documented it immediately. March 25th, abandoned train yard scouted. Supplies acquired under high-risk conditions. Human threat confirmed. Traps observed. Evasion successful. Psychological note. Humans capable of strategic hunting. Survival contingent on invisibility, caution, and quick decision-making. Montana signal persistent. That night, I camped in a snow-covered embankment near the yard, firelight flickering against the cold, and I thought about the lessons I had learned. The living are just as dangerous as the dead. Supplies can be a trap, not a gift. Invisibility isn't just survival, it's the difference between life and death. The radio crackled faintly in the distance. Montana. Hope. A reason to keep moving. And for the first time, I felt the weight of purpose outweigh the exhaustion gnawing at my body. The train yard was behind me, a frozen battlefield of survival. Ahead lay more snow, more roads, more danger. But I had survived. I was still invisible. And I was still moving. The storm hit just past dawn, a white wall rolling over the mountains like an advancing army. Snow battered my face, the wind slicing through layers of clothing, and visibility dropped to nothing in seconds. I trudged along the narrow road, boots sinking into drifts taller than my knees. Every step felt heavier than the last, and I realized that survival wasn't just about hunger or humans. Sometimes, it was about weather. Rule number 1 repeated itself relentlessly: stay invisible. But against a blizzard, invisibility becomes a double-edged sword. The wind muffles your sound, yes, but it also masks the approach of danger. One wrong movement, one misjudged step, and a fall or ambush could mean death. I found shelter in the ruins of a stone cabin. The roof had partially collapsed, but the walls held against the storm. Inside, the cold bit through my gloves and jacket, and I realized that fire wasn't optional, it was essential. I scavenged wood from broken furniture, balancing warmth with the risk of smoke drawing attention. I ate a few rations, measuring every bite, and rationed my water. Hunger gnawed at me, but it was secondary to the cold. My hands were numb, my lips cracked, my vision blurred at the edges. Isolation pressed in like a living weight. Hours passed. The wind roared outside, carrying the sound of broken branches and distant groans. Humans or infected, I couldn't tell. I stayed low, revolver close, listening, counting my breaths, calculating my next moves. In the silence between gusts, I thought about the people I had lost, Bill, Helen, neighbors, and the survivors I had seen along the way. Snowbound and alone, the weight of human absence pressed down on me more than hunger or cold ever could. By nightfall, the storm had no intention of letting up. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. I layered myself in blankets, insulated against the cold as best I could. My revolver rested against my chest, my mind replaying every lesson from the first months of the outbreak. Invisibility is survival. Observation over engagement. Humans are as dangerous as the infected. Never underestimate hunger, cold, or isolation. I wrote in my journal, hands trembling from cold and fatigue. March 28th, snowstorm ongoing. Supplies sufficient for 24 hours if rationed. Observation. Isolation intensifies psychological strain. Hunger minimal but present. Maintain vigilance. Do not engage unless necessary. Montana signal persistent but weak. Survival contingent on patience and caution. Sleep came in short bursts. Every creak of the cabin, Every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. My mind wandered, memories, regrets, fears, and I fought to stay focused. Isolation is a predator of its own kind. It gnaws at rational thought, erodes stoicism, and tests the mind in ways no physical threat ever could. I realized that the first year wasn't just about surviving zombies or hostile humans. It was about surviving the solitude, the gnawing uncertainty, and the cold that never truly leaves. By the next morning, the storm had eased slightly. Visibility returned to a hazy gray, and I packed my gear, checking supplies and weapons meticulously. Every ounce counted. Every step was calculated. The Montana signal crackled faintly, a lifeline, fragile but undeniable. As I stepped back into the storm-scarred world, I understood something fundamental. Surviving a blizzard wasn't just a physical test. It was mental. Every thought, every decision, every step taken while alone and cold was a testament to resilience, preparation, and the stubborn will to keep moving forward. Snowbound and alone, I had learned to endure not only the elements but the quiet terror of my own mind. And that lesson, as harsh as it was, would carry me further than bullets, traps, or even the dead. The road stretched ahead like a white scar through the mountains, littered with the remnants of a world that had stopped. Snow-covered cars, trucks, and the occasional shopping cart, but not all was hidden. Some of it, human or animal, was left exposed to the cold, frozen in grotesque positions, a testament to desperation and the unforgiving winter. I walked cautiously, boots crunching over ice and compacted snow, revolver ready. Rule number 1 echoed in my mind: stay invisible. Every frozen body, every shadowed pile of wreckage could conceal danger, human or infected. The first sign of the road's brutality came in the form of a scavenger's fate. A man, frozen mid-step, leaned over his vehicle as if checking something under the hood. His face, pale and cracked from frostbite, was frozen in terror. I stepped closer, careful, and realized the snow had preserved him like a grotesque sculpture. Hunger, fear, and miscalculation had killed him. I exhaled slowly. Survival wasn't about avoiding zombies alone. It was about avoiding mistakes, the ones that humans make when desperation outweighs reason. Further along, I stumbled across a scene that froze me in more ways than one. 2 scavengers had apparently fought over supplies, leaving one dead and the other wounded, half buried in snow. Blood had frozen into jagged patterns, a grim marker of human cruelty. I noted it in my journal. April 2nd, observation. Human desperation results in intrahuman conflict. Frozen fatalities abundant. Psychological impact significant. Maintain invisibility and distance. Supplies limited but manageable. Animal carcasses were no less jarring. Deer, wolves, and even dogs lay frozen along the road, victims of both starvation and the brutal winter. Some had been scavenged partially by humans, others left untouched. Their presence reminded me that survival was a constant negotiation with death. Every step forward was a decision weighed against the probability of encountering predators, human or otherwise. The psychological toll of seeing so much death, humans and animals alike, began to weigh on me. The road wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental one. Each frozen corpse reminded me that mistakes weren't always survivable, that the world had become a brutal test of calculation, patience, and stoicism. I kept moving. I couldn't linger. The Montana signal crackled faintly, a distant promise of other living humans, of potential safety. That hope, fragile as it was, pushed me forward over icy hills, past frozen vehicles, and through endless white wastelands. By evening, I found shelter in an abandoned highway rest stop, snow drifts piling against the walls. I rationed water and food carefully, revolver within reach, and documented the day's horrors. April 2nd, frozen roadkill encountered, human and animal. Observation: consequences of environmental hazards and human desperation. Psychological impact moderate, stoicism maintained. Montana signal persistent. Supplies sufficient for 36 hours if rationed. Continue north. As I lay on the cold floor, I realized that the first year of survival wasn't just about avoiding the dead. It was about navigating a landscape littered with the mistakes of the living, the mercy of the frozen elements, and the constant pressure of hunger and exhaustion. Every corpse was a warning. Every frozen animal, a lesson. And every step forward, a testament to resilience, planning, and the stubborn will to survive. The radio had been a faint whisper for weeks, barely audible over static and the groan of the wind through the mountains. But that evening, as I huddled in a snow-covered culvert for shelter, something shifted. The static thinned. A voice, ragged but unmistakable, broke through the white noise. Boise, copy. Montana survivors, safe zone, repeat. My heart skipped a beat. For months, the signal had been a ghost, a fragile thread connecting me to the idea of life beyond survival. Now it was real, clear, coherent. I fiddled with the dials, adjusting the antenna, straining for any detail. The voice continued. North of Missoula, fortified, supplies, help needed, repeat. I scribbled furiously in my journal. April 5th, Montana signal clearer. Evidence of organized survivor group north of Missoula. Supplies mentioned. Potential for safe zone. Transmission intermittent but consistent. Objective. Determine viability of contact. Caution advised, human threats likely en route. The voice carried hints of desperation beneath the calm tone. Not fear of the infected. They sounded experienced, organized. But fear of something else, humans? Other humans, hungry and violent, who might consider travelers like me a threat. That night I stayed awake, listening. The signal returned at intervals, offering snippets of survival updates. Rations low, perimeter patrols active, occasional scavenger threats. They spoke of discipline, routines, and rules, the same rules I had lived by for months. Hope, I realized, came with a price. Following the signal meant leaving the safety of the roads I had mapped, exposing myself to unknown terrain, and potentially encountering hostile humans. But staying put meant stagnation, slow decay, and the crushing weight of isolation. I made my decision. I would follow the signal. Slowly, carefully, maintaining invisibility and vigilance. The mountains were unforgiving, and the journey north would test every skill I had honed over the first year of the outbreak. Before dawn, I packed my gear meticulously. Every ounce counted. Every ration, every round of ammunition, every tool could mean the difference between life and death. I left a careful mark of my presence in my journal, a breadcrumb trail should I fail. April 6th, travel north initiated. Montana signal persistent. Terrain hazardous, human threats anticipated. Supplies sufficient for initial journey. Psychological note, hope present but cautious. Invisibility and patience paramount. The first day of travel north brought both relief and dread. The signal crackled faintly but consistently, guiding me through frozen forests, past avalanche-prone slopes and along narrow ridges. I encountered no humans, no infected, only the wind, snow, and the occasional frozen corpse. Yet the clarity of the signal changed everything. It transformed hope from abstract into direction. It gave purpose to each calculated step, each rationed meal, each decision to remain unseen. By evening, I found a sheltered grove shielded by snow-laden evergreens. I huddled against the cold, revolver within reach, listening to the faint Montana signal. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a fleeting thought, connection. Not just survival, but contact, community, and the fragile warmth of humanity. And yet, the voice reminded me that the world had not changed. Survival was still measured by skill, patience, and ruthless calculation. Human threats, environmental hazards, and the undead remained constants. The signal was hope, but it was also a warning. Moving forward would not be easy. April 6th, nightfall. Montana signal consistent. Observation. Potential for organized human survivors. Risk assessment, moderate to high. Psychological state cautiously optimistic. Objective. Maintain direction, avoid engagement, and reach northern coordinates alive. As I lay in the snow, listening to the intermittent voice guiding me north, I realized something essential. The first year of the outbreak had taught me to survive the dead, the living, the elements, and the gnawing loneliness. Now hope had entered the equation. And hope, dangerous as it might be, demanded action. The signal led me into a narrow valley, pine trees bowing under the weight of snow, shadows stretching like long fingers in the fading light. My boots sank into drifts and the wind cut through my layers, but I pressed on. Montana was close, I could feel it. The signal grew stronger, more insistent, like a heartbeat in the static. Rule number 1, stay invisible. Yet the closer I got, the harder it was to remain just an observer. Human presence was near. I spotted them first, 3 figures moving cautiously through the trees. Unlike the scavengers I had seen along the highway, these people moved with coordination, scanning their surroundings, communicating with subtle gestures. Their weapons were makeshift but functional. They were survivors, organized, disciplined, alive. I ducked behind a snow-covered boulder and observed. My revolver was ready, but I didn't want conflict. Montana promised safety, not violence. The woman at the front held a rifle loosely, scanning the tree-line. Her face was partially covered with a scarf, but I caught the sharpness in her eyes, the way she calculated each step. One of the men carried a crowbar, the third held a backpack overflowing with supplies. They were cautious, hungry perhaps, but alive and dangerous. I considered my options. Approaching them could lead to death. Staying hidden might delay my progress. And yet, the Montana signal, clearer now than ever, hinted that these were the voices I had been following for weeks. I stepped forward, deliberately showing my hands. "Jack Hart," I called softly, voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I'm coming from Boise. I'm following the signal." They froze. The woman raised her rifle, scanning me. The man with the crowbar stepped forward, tense. Silence stretched across the snowy clearing. Then the woman spoke, her voice sharp but not hostile. "Montana?" "Yes," I said. "I've been following the signal. I mean no harm." The tension lingered for a heartbeat too long, then the woman lowered her rifle slightly. They exchanged quick, assessing glances, and one by one they stepped closer. The first physical contact with other humans in months was surreal. Hands shook, cautious but deliberate. Eyes scanned constantly. Stories were exchanged in hushed tones: Boise, Idaho, the highway, frozen corpses, scavengers, traps. I told them what I had learned, what I had survived. And they told me of Montana, a fortified safe zone north of Missoula, supplies, shelter, rules, but also danger. Other humans, desperate, hungry, territorial. Trust was earned here, not given. That night, we huddled near a fire in a small clearing. The snow outside was relentless, but inside there was warmth, not just from the flames but from the knowledge that I wasn't alone. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to eat more than rations demanded, to drink without constant calculation. I wrote in my journal. April 10th, first encounter with Montana survivors successful. Human threat minimal and controlled setting. Observation, group organized, disciplined, cautious. Psychological impact positive, hope reinforced. Objective, reach fortified zone north of Missoula alive. But even in the glow of the fire, I remained vigilant. Survival had taught me that humans could turn on each other, and strangers could become threats in seconds. The Montana signal had led me here, but trust would be earned over time. As I drifted into a shallow sleep, I realized something profound. The first year had been a test of invisibility, patience, and stoicism. Now it was a test of humanity, whether I could maintain my principles, my caution, and my survival instincts while interacting with others who were equally desperate and equally dangerous. Montana was close. But the real challenge, I knew, had only just begun. The first sight of fortified Montana was surreal. Barbed wire stretched along the perimeter, reinforced by scavenged metal panels and wooden barricades. Watchtowers loomed over the snow-covered compound, and a faint glow of firelight flickered through small windows. From a distance, it looked more like a prison than a sanctuary, and yet, in a world where survival was measured in bullets and calculation, it was paradise. Rule number 1, stay invisible, felt almost quaint now. The challenge had shifted, integration without losing oneself. The approach was tense. The 3 guides from the forest led me through a narrow gate, guarded by 2 sentries. They scrutinized me carefully, checking my clothes, gear, and eyes for signs of deception. "Montana?" I said, voice calm. A man in his 40s, dressed in layers of scavenged military gear, stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "Jack Hart," he said, confirming my identity. "You've been following the signal?" "Yes. I've traveled from Boise. Alone." He nodded. "Rules first. All newcomers are observed for 2 days. Supplies rationed until cleared. Integration is conditional." I understood. Survival had always been conditional. Here, rules were not suggestions, they were law. Inside the walls, life was harsh but structured. Residents moved in routines: firewood distribution, food preparation, patrolling the perimeter. Children huddled near improvised heaters, elders mended clothes or scouted supplies. Everyone carried weapons, every eye scanning constantly. The Montana safe zone wasn't just survival. It was discipline, vigilance, and hierarchy forged in months of desperation. I observed quietly, noting behaviors, mapping routines, and assessing threats. Stoicism remained my shield, invisibility my principle. I contributed silently, rationing my knowledge, my skills, my effort. Every action measured, every word weighed. Supplies were impressive. Canned goods stacked in neat rows, water filters operational, traps maintained beyond the compound. It was clear the group had survived not just through courage, but through strict order and careful planning. Yet, beneath the surface I saw tension. Factions whispered in corners, eyes narrowed at newcomers. Trust was earned through risk and endurance. Hunger had taught them discipline, but fear had taught them suspicion. The first night, I slept in a small shelter allotted to newcomers. I kept my revolver within reach, journal beside me, recording every detail. My thoughts circled around the lessons of the road. Humans could be allies, but trust must be earned. Survival depended on rules as much as skills. Stoicism was not just protection, but currency in a world that tested morality daily. April 15th, fortified Montana reached. Observation: disciplined, structured community. Rules strictly enforced. Psychological note: human threat minimized within compound, but vigilance essential. Integration conditional. Supplies sufficient. Montana signal no longer required. Physical safety prioritized. By morning I began my integration. Tasks were assigned: firewood duty, perimeter cleaning, minor repairs. Observation remained critical. Every resident watched the newcomers closely. I noticed subtle tests: a supply shortage, a question about route details, a small tool intentionally misplaced to measure my reaction. I responded as I had always done, calmly, deliberately, without emotion. Stoicism had carried me through the dead, the blizzards, the scavengers. Now it would carry me through the living, the rules, and the moral compromises of fortified Montana. As I watched the sun rise over snow-covered barricades, I realized the first year had culminated here. Not just survival, but living within the fragile framework of civilization rebuilt from chaos. The world outside remained dangerous: scavengers, hostile humans, and the undead, but inside these walls humanity endured. For the first time, I felt a tentative connection to something beyond my own survival. A purpose beyond avoidance and evasion. Montana was safety, structure, and community, but it was also a mirror. It reflected the harsh truths I had learned. Survival demands vigilance, patience, calculation, and above all, the careful management of trust. And I would need all of it to endure the months ahead. Fortified Montana was more than walls and firelight. It was a web of rules, observation, and unspoken hierarchies. Every action, every word, every glance was measured. Trust was earned, never given, and one misstep could make a newcomer a liability. I had survived zombies, blizzards, scavengers, and frozen highways, but navigating human politics would test a different skill entirely. Rule number 1 remained: stay invisible, but now invisibility meant discretion, patience, and careful assessment. The first test came within hours. A supply ration was deliberately miscounted, a subtle challenge to see who noticed. Another resident whispered to a third, glancing in my direction. I observed, noting reactions, calculating consequences. I didn't react. I waited. Stoicism was my shield, patience my weapon. The man in command, known as Carson, approached me later. His eyes were sharp like a hawk's, scanning for weaknesses. "You notice everything," he said almost as a statement. "That's good. Montana runs on observation. Mistakes are fatal. You understand?" "Yes," I said. No hesitation. No inflection. Just fact. "Good," he replied. "Keep observing. Act when necessary. Trust is earned through consistent action, not words." Over the next days, I integrated slowly. I helped distribute rations, repaired barricades, and patrolled the perimeter. Every movement was monitored, by Carson, by the residents, by myself. I noted subtle alliances, rivalries, and tension lines. Montana was strong, but the first year of survival had taught me that internal strife could be just as lethal as scavengers or zombies. I recorded everything in my journal. April 20th, integration ongoing. Observation. Residents highly disciplined, trust conditional. Minor internal conflicts observed. Tasks assigned consistent with survival needs. Human threat minimized within compound but potential for internal conflict high. Psychological note. Vigilance paramount. The next challenge came unexpectedly. A small patrol returned with a wounded stranger, claiming to have been attacked by a rival survivor group. The compound erupted in discussion, opinions split. Help the stranger and risk introducing danger, or refuse aid and risk moral collapse. Carson looked at me. "What do you think?" I paused. My instincts screamed caution. Humans could be as lethal as the undead, especially desperate ones. But Montana's survival depended not just on defense, but on measured risk and community cohesion. "I help," I said calmly, "with observation and containment. No surprises." Carson nodded slightly. The wounded man was quarantined, treated under strict supervision. My decision was noted, silently acknowledged. Trust, fragile as snow on a ledge, had been earned. Life within the walls became a balance of vigilance and quiet contribution. I learned the subtle ways of Montana, who to speak with, who to observe from a distance, how to navigate supply disputes, and how to enforce rules without drawing attention. Stoicism became my currency, patience my shield, and careful calculation my map through social terrain more dangerous than any highway or canyon. April 25th, rules of trust internalized. Observation and discretion reinforced. Contribution to community ongoing. Human threat within compound managed via discipline. Psychological state stable. Hope tempered with caution. Montana signal irrelevant. Local intelligence prioritized. By the end of the month, I realized a truth I hadn't fully grasped before. Surviving the first year of the outbreak had been about isolation, evasion, and endurance. But living here, truly surviving within Montana, required mastery of something equally vital, the delicate art of human trust. Here the dead were a constant threat. Outside, the roads and blizzards waited. But inside, the living demanded strategy, patience, and the relentless management of perception and action. And I had survived all of it. The morning air was thin and bitter, cutting through the layers of clothing I had grown used to. I had been assigned to accompany a small scout patrol to check the northern ridge, an opportunity to stretch my legs beyond the compound while observing the terrain for any threats. Montana had rules, but it also relied on intelligence, and scouts were the lifeline. Rule number 1 remained: stay invisible, but now invisibility was also about reading the environment and interpreting danger before it arrived. The patrol consisted of 3 others: Kara, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s, Lee, a wiry man whose hands never stopped moving, cleaning, adjusting, checking, and a young recruit, timid but alert. I trailed slightly behind, scanning the snow-covered landscape. The mountains were silent except for wind and occasional ice creaks. But something felt off, too quiet, too measured. Nature, after a year of chaos, always had signs if you knew how to read them. And then the scout froze. "Tracks," she whispered, pointing to a narrow trail through the snow. I crouched beside her, examining them. Human. Recent. Deliberate. Not wandering, not scavenging, hunting. I recognized the type immediately. Desperate survivors, likely armed, territorial, and skilled in ambush. The instinct that had kept me alive since Boise kicked in. Lee's voice was low. "They're moving fast, headed toward Montana. My pulse quickened. The compound was vulnerable. Even with walls, guns, and traps, desperation could push humans into reckless violence. I calculated their probable approach: the wind, the snow cover, the paths through the ridges. Time until first contact: less than 12 hours. We returned to Montana immediately, tracking the approaching threat carefully to avoid detection. Inside the walls, Carson was already assessing the situation with grim efficiency. "Scouts report human movement from the north," he said. "I scanned us like knives. They know the safe zone exists. Likely hostile. Prepare defenses. Observation only, no engagement unless necessary." I nodded. My mind raced, reviewing months of survival experience. Traps, ambushes, scouting, invisibility. Now all of it mattered not just for me but for a community I had begun to value. That evening I helped reinforce barricades, set additional traps along likely approach paths, and advised on observation points. Trust, patience, and skill were no longer abstract principles. They were literal measures of life and death. May 1st, external threat confirmed. Human hostile. Time to first contact estimated at less than 12 hours. Montana defenses reinforced. Psychological note: survival instincts integrated with community responsibility. Stakes increased, vigilance heightened. Even in the quiet moments by the fire, the looming threat weighed heavily. Unlike scavengers I had avoided on the road, these humans were organized, desperate, and aware of Montana's existence. Mistakes could be catastrophic. By night, I patrolled the perimeter with Kara. The snow muffled movement, but not my observation. Shadows shifted along the northern ridge. Figures, moving cautiously, checking for traps, advancing toward the walls. Hunger, fear, and calculation etched into every motion. I whispered into my journal. May 1st, scout observation, hostile group approaching. Behavior calculated, deliberate. Montana must remain invisible to them until defensive advantage is maximized. Survival contingent on stealth, preparation, and discipline. The first year had taught me how to survive alone. The second, integration into a community, was teaching me how to survive as part of a collective. Now that lesson was being tested to its absolute limits. As I watched the snow-shrouded ridge, I realized something terrifying. Survival was no longer just personal. It was communal. And the human threat waiting beyond the walls would test everything I had learned: invisibility, stoicism, patience, and moral calculation. Montana had become more than a refuge. It was a crucible. The night was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every heartbeat feel loud enough to betray you. Snow fell in thick sheets, muffling footsteps, masking movement and concealing danger. From the walls of fortified Montana, the northern ridge loomed dark and indistinct, but I could feel them, the hostile humans we had tracked, creeping closer with each passing hour. Rule number 1, stay invisible, had evolved into something more. It was no longer just survival. It was protection, strategy, and the careful orchestration of human life against human threat. The first alarm rang just past midnight. Motion sensors triggered along the northern perimeter. Figures emerged from the snow like shadows, cautious, calculating, weapons glinting in firelight. Carson barked orders and the compound came alive. Barricades were reinforced, traps armed, residents taking positions. My revolver rested heavy in my hands, mind sharp, senses honed from months of survival. May 2nd, external engagement initiated. Human threat confirmed. Objective: defend Montana. Psychological note: adrenaline high, stoicism required. The first volley of movement was met with fire. Bullets ricocheted off metal and wood. Shouts echoed across the snowy courtyard. I stayed low, picking calculated shots, covering retreat points, guiding residents silently with hand signals. The attackers were clever, not reckless scavengers but organized, patient, desperate humans who had learned to exploit weaknesses. I recognized their tactics instantly: feints, probes, testing traps. Every instinct I had developed over the first year was being applied in real time. Hours passed in a haze of cold, gunfire, and strategy. The siege was relentless, but Montana's walls and the disciplined residents held. I observed patterns, predicted movements, adjusted trap placements, and reinforced defenses. Every action was measured. Every breath was counted. I wrote in my journal under the faint glow of firelight. May 2nd, siege ongoing. Human attackers organized, persistent, and adaptive. Montana defenses effective but under pressure. Psychological state tense. Focus maintained. Survival contingent on coordination, patience, and precision. At one point, an attacker breached a secondary barricade. I engaged, revolver drawn, heart hammering, mind razor sharp. A single, controlled shot ended the threat. Silence returned. Montana was secure for now. But the siege had revealed a truth I couldn't ignore. Human desperation is as lethal as the infected, and trust is fragile even inside fortified walls. By dawn, the attackers had retreated, leaving the ridge silent once more. Snow covered footprints, blood, and signs of struggle alike. Montana had survived, but not without cost. Minor injuries, damaged barricades, and the heavy weight of psychological strain pressed on every resident. I exhaled slowly, exhaustion settling into my bones. The first year of the outbreak had been a test of isolation, survival, and calculation. This siege was the culmination, a brutal reminder that humans, not the undead, were the most dangerous variable. I recorded the final entry for my first-year journal. May 3rd, siege concluded. Montana defended successfully. Human threat confirmed as primary danger. Psychological note: resilience tested. Stoicism effective. Observation: survival requires vigilance, calculation, and controlled engagement. Integration into community reinforced. First year completed. Objective: continue survival, reinforce Montana, and prepare for long-term sustainability. As I looked out over the ridge, the snow settling over the battlefield, I felt a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious hope. The first year of survival had forged me, from a solitary prepper navigating frozen highways and ambushes, to a disciplined observer in a community tested by fire, desperation, and human nature itself. I had survived, but the world had not changed. The dead still roamed. Desperate humans still hunted. The cold still bit. And Montana, my refuge, my crucible, would remain a battleground for vigilance, trust, and survival. I checked my revolver one last time. Loaded. Ready. Always. Because in this world, the first year was only the beginning.